I've had this story on my mind since I started writing it for RHHFY over a year ago. I posted a handful of chapters, but got pretty busy with work. I've got some time on my hands, so I picked it back up and rewrote it to give it a better foundation for where I want to take the story. The inspiration behind it comes from the modern technology meets medieval times theme of 1632 by Eric Flint, with a tech versus magic twist. This story explores what would happen if a character from science fiction was thrown into a fantasy world. How would they affect the world, and how would it affect them back? Critiques are welcome. I'm writing this for my own fun, but as long as I'm posting it, I want it to be enjoyable for others to read too. Prologue. If there's one thing most students don't consider when traveling to Saturn's Johansson Engineering Academy, it's that on their 8-week sublight shuttle ride from Earth, things may go terribly wrong and they'll end up on an estranged planet in an uncharted galaxy. As far as Arthur knew, he was in the middle of the most awesome, parent-free summer vacation that a 15-year-old computer geek could dream of. He had nothing but time on his hands and intended to spend it catching up on this year's latest and greatest video games using the shuttle's 90 petabit extranet connection. This week's pick, a fantasy game of sorts. In space, no one can hear you. Slay dragons! Arthur yelled into the mic as he thrust the torch to the fuse, and their crude rocket roared to life with fury. The missile shot from its perch like lightning, and in moments hit the hillside downrange with a satisfying pop. Holy science, it actually worked, exclaimed Alex, his best friend and self-proclaimed minion sidekick, currently playing from his computer back home on Earth. Alex was a year older than Arthur, and this was his last summer before college, too. They had hoped to spend it together, but then Arthur was accepted to Johansson Engineering Academy for gifted and talented students, and so they were doing their best to hang out through games online. Congrats, you didn't blow us up this time. And here I thought we were dead again for sure, Alex admitted. It looks like version 67 is a success. I told you it'd work this time, said Arthur, taking off his haptic gloves and Synapse game visor and getting up to grab another soda. You said that the last 66 times, teased Alex. Well, Thomas Edison made 1,000 unsuccessful attempts at inventing the light bulb, so I'd say we're ahead of the curve. The design is finally perfected, and with it, we will ravage these medieval savages, said Arthur as he opened another Megabolt Cola with a hiss, took a long sip, walking back to the computer, and slammed the can down on the desk. Creatures of Argonath, Arthur proclaimed in the manliest, lord-like voice he could manage. Bow before me. I bring science to your backwards world. The land is ripe for your taking, Lord Emperor, Alex joked, playing along. Great wizards and kings alike have yet to witness the power of this technology you've mastered. Yes, the kingdoms will resist me. They only know the old ways. But the peasants, they will embrace me, for I give them what they have not. Power, Arthur exclaimed. Of course it would not have come to pass if it weren't for the guidance of our Grand Vizier, Wikipedia the Wise, and her boundless knowledge of chemistry, mathematics, engineering, and, well, everything really. Yeah, seriously, said Alex, breaking character. Though I'm glad I can't smell half the stuff we're crafting. Making that gunpowder was pretty gross. As it is, virtual reality is way too immersive for its own good. Getting bamboo for the rocket tubes had been easy, but it had taken them days to manufacture and test the propellant for a handful of rockets using the old-school method of making gunpowder. It called for urine, manure, wood ash, and a whole lot of mixing, plus a time enchantment to speed the reaction up. The game's crafting system accounted for all of it, and the graphics were impeccable. Despite the difficulties, Phase 1 had gone well. The next step was getting the formula to an alchemist so they could begin Phase 2 of his plan to pit science against magic, the mass manufacturing of explosives. This is my boomstick, Arthur thought with a smirk. Hey, let's take a break. World domination can wait until after lunch, said Arthur. Okay, man, hit me up when you're ready again. I think I'll go spread word of the coming sci-apocalypse to the NPCs, Alex joked. It'll set the stage for our grand entrance. Cool later, said Arthur, before logging out and opening his things-to-do list to cross out the line. Labeled rockets. Data, said Arthur, Heat me up some ravioli, the one with red sauce. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. Now continue amazing story. The Digidex on Arthur's wrist lit up and a perfectly synthesized voice of actor Brent Spiner from Star Trek, The Next Generation voiced, heating ravioli meal number 5. There were hundreds of AI personalities Arthur had downloaded to his Digidex, and Arthur's love of pop culture science fiction made Data an easy choice for his trip to Jupiter. Arthur continued to scribble in the notepad, jotting down ideas from wiki diagrams on blast furnaces until a notification chime came from the cockpit. "Captain, there's a proximity alert," said Data. "Oh yeah? Is it another asteroid?" Arthur asked, making his way to the cockpit. "Inconclusive," replied Data. "The shuttle is detecting a gravity well near the ship." "I thought we were weeks from Saturn." "Put it on screen," Arthur commanded. The digitized screen activated and overlaid atop the cockpit window, zooming in on something. It wasn't exactly clear. In the expanse of space highlighted on the screen sat an empty void, light bending around its edges like a spherical mirror. "Wait, what's that dark spot out there? Is that a... I am detecting a spatial anomaly 40 Maunder in diameter, consistent with a Type B microsingularity," Data stated. "A black hole? How's that possible?" exclaimed Arthur. "Where did it come from?" Suddenly, a wave of turbulence rumbled through the ship's bulkheads as the void's gravitational lens began to fold open, revealing something inside. "Unknown, the phenomenon is in a state of gravimetric flux," warned Data. "Its energy signature is consistent with a naturally forming warp bubble created in the wake of 2 intersecting FTL drives." The staccato beeping of an alarm pierced the growing turbulence. Arthur's eyes darted toward the ballistic trajectory monitor. "We're being pulled off course." "Attempting to compensate using emergency maneuvers," said Data. "Brace for thruster firing in 5 seconds." Arthur scrambled into the chair and strapped in tight. Moments later, the starboard RCS thrusters roared to life with a jolt that felt like a kick in the side. As the void began to warp, the view inside it came into focus. Arthur could make out stars behind it. No, through it. It was no longer a sphere, but some kind of tunnel, and at the end of it, a bright blue and green planet came into view. One like Arthur had never seen before. Arthur looked back at the trajectory monitor that now showed them barely holding course, with maximum thrust against whatever the hell he was seeing through the window. "Any other ideas?" he asked. "Captain, I suggest we use the emergency escape system," said Data. "The ejection capsule alone may have a small enough mass to escape the gravitational pull of the anomaly. If they survived, he'd be trapped in a cramped 1-meter capsule for a week until rescued, but it'd sure beat dying." "Are you sure?" Arthur yelled with a tremor in his voice. "I mean, are you sure? Ditching the shuttle was a last resort option reserved for only the most extreme circumstances. This certainly counted. Arthur just never expected he'd ever have to resort to it. Also, he heard ejecting hurt like hell. "Inconclusive," Data replied. "Oh God, please don't let me die." "Okay, here goes," said Arthur. He reached down and grabbed the white and red striped ejection handles to his sides, hesitated a moment, then pulled them. A segmented metal shell folded over him with a tink, tink, tink and sealed itself to the base of the floor around his seat. Through the pod's tiny window came the bright flash of exploding bolts as the cockpit canopy gave way. What followed was a bit hazy. He remembered feeling more positive G's than he'd ever felt before, making his body so heavy that he thought he might smash through the floor. His vision was blurred, and at some point Data was reporting something to him, but he couldn't make it out. It hadn't worked. They had been pulled in. A moment later, they were rushing towards the blue and green planet, and a voice was yelling, "Brace for impact," and then everything went black. Across the valley, in the low tower of Gryffindel Castle, stood Terranath Trassalor with narrow eyes scanning the hills for where Firestar had landed. His heart was still beating hard in his chest. The initial shock hadn't yet worn off. Just a moment ago, he was enjoying a quiet evening reading outside his study when a crack of thunder filled the air, and a streak of fire greater than he'd ever seen lit up the night, briefly transforming it into day. "Guard!" he yelled at one of the men standing in the courtyard below his balcony. "Stop gawking at the sky and fetch the captain. Tell him to assemble his men on horseback immediately." "Yes, mage," replied the guard, before hurrying off. A fire star would be exactly what he needed to get promoted from a mage in a backwater human town and transferred to a position of his choosing in one of the elfin capital cities. Chapter. Arthur opened his eyes to wisps of smoke rising around him. The last few minutes were a blur. His head was pounding and he felt a sharp pain in his left side. There was a strong, noxious odor mixing with a cool night breeze coming from a torn panel in Pod's shell. "Ugh," Arthur groaned, staring at the hole in the pod. He had guessed that a blue and green planet might suggest plant life and oxygen. It was a miracle he wasn't dead, but with these fumes he'd have to escape to keep it that way. Moving was hard. Why did he feel so tired? And why was it so confusing to undo his harness? It wasn't hard to put it on, but there were so many straps. Once, unbuckled, Arthur pounded the door release, blowing it off its hinges and away from the pod, revealing a dirt field. He stumbled out of it, tripping on the lip of the door. He kept telling himself to walk as far away from the burning capsule as he could. He didn't know how many steps he took, but it felt like a lot before he collapsed. The next thing Arthur knew, he was being carried into a room in the arms of a young man. Arthur tried to speak, but had a coughing fit instead. "Bring the boy over here and set him on the bed," said an older man's voice. "By the saints, he's a mess. Ella, fetch me a cloth for the bleeding. We need to get Friar Darren." Arthur's consciousness faded. When he came to again, there was a new voice in the room speaking to him, a soft, aged voice taking in pace like a narrator telling a story. It came from what Arthur made out to be a short figure with thick, matted fur, like a Wookiee's. "Hello, friend. I'm Darren, the town friar. I'm here to help you, but my magic must be accepted willingly. May I heal you?" What did it say again? Arthur had lost the words as soon as they were said, but the creature had a gentle voice, so he nodded. "Thank you," said the Wookiee. "I'll do what I can." Arthur sensed the creature move close to him and place a hand on his forehead. He felt the warm hand on his skin, its worn palm pressing gently against him. Then the warmth seemed to grow. It flowed deeper into him, into his flesh and bone, down his body into his limbs, and then deeper still into his mind, calming him and caressing him. It jogged an old memory from when he was little. He was with his mom on the train, and when they got off together at the station, Arthur realized that he left his favorite stuffed animal behind. He was crushed and began crying, worried he'd never see it again, but then his mom knelt next to him and gave him a big, loving hug. "Shh, shh, it'll be okay," she said, in a soothing voice with her arms around him. "Everything will be okay." The turmoil flowed out of him and was replaced with a deep comfort. When his mom talked to the lady behind the counter, they called the station ahead and found his stuffed animal. Everything did turn out okay. All in the world was okay again. When the hand lifted off him, the memory began to fade, but the soothing warmth of it stayed with him. "It is done," said Darren. "He will still need rest. I've only begun the process. His body will finish healing on its own." The conversation continued, fading into soft mumbling as Arthur drifted to sleep. Jackie. Next morning, Arthur woke up with a new sense of clarity that he seemed to have lacked for days. He remembered a few crazy dreams, but one thing he apparently didn't dream was the cottage room he was in. It had stone walls and a wooden ceiling, and was dimly lit by the sunlight coming through a curtain made of animal hide. He was in a bed with coarse wool sheets tucked under a fur blanket, and there was a girl sitting at his bedside looking at him bare-chested. "Hey, are you awake?" asked the girl. She was close to Arthur's age, maybe a bit younger, with short brown hair that just touched the shoulders of a dusty blue dress. "Yeah, unless I'm dreaming," replied Arthur as he sat up in the bed. It was slowly coming. Back to him. The anomaly being pulled in and crash-landing on a strange planet, though he thought he had hallucinated the rest. At one point, he remembered talking to an animal, but the girl in front of him looked very human. Was he still hallucinating? "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Papa said you hit your head and might have died." "Okay, I guess," said Arthur, feeling the spot on his head where a line of hair was missing, but there was no wound as far as he could tell. He looked around the room. It was sparsely decorated with a candle atop a crooked wooden nightstand and a stool that the girl sat on. "Hey, where am I and what am I doing here?" he asked, trying to remember how he got here. "You're in Wedwick. I'm Ella, I live with my papa and 2 brothers, and this is our home. We found you next to your carriage in the field last night." Well, he may as well found out more before he starts freaking out. There were a lot of colonies out there. Maybe he'd landed amongst a group of Luddites living life the old-fashioned way, the very old-fashioned way. Or rediscovered a lost colony that had regressed to the Dark Ages. Regardless, a subspace distress signal can reach pretty far, and the escape pod would have been emitting one before landing. "And you're Arthur?" Ella guessed hesitantly. "Yeah. Wait, how do you know that?" he asked accusingly. "Your spirit told us," blurted Ella, blushing. "You'd been ill, so we wanted to wash your clothes. When we tried to take off your wrist pendant, he started talking to us. Papa's been talking to him all morning. Lieutenant Commander Data is very nice for a spirit, even if he talks kind of funny. He's been telling us of his travels in the spirit world aboard the USS Enterprise." Arthur stared at her incredulously. "I see. I'll have to remind Lieutenant Commander Data that he shouldn't speak so freely in the company of strangers, lest he frighten them, or worse." "And my clothes?" "Oh, your tunic is on the line outside. Or is it armor? It's heavy and thick for cloth, but very soft, like rabbit fur," said Ella. "We tried to wash them, but they wouldn't get wet, so we put them out to sun clean. Papa thinks you're from the city. You must serve a good elf lord to have such fine clothes with a drying spell on them and to carry a spirit pendant." "An elf lord? It's not exactly like that, but I'll be happy to explain if you fetch my clothes for me," Arthur urged, feeling especially vulnerable without his flight suit or Digidex. "Of course," she said, her face blushing again as she hurried out of the room. Moments later, Ella was back with Arthur's flight suit and matching gloves. Its color setting was still set to flight white, and it was as pristine as ever. The super hydrophobic mesh kept it impeccably clean, and the electromuscular assistance system built into it made it durable and safe for interstellar spaceflight. Ella waited outside the room as Arthur donned the suit and pocketed the gloves. The inner arm displays woven into the fabric briefly lit up, and Arthur enabled power-saving mode, which engaged EAS just enough to take off about 10 of the suits, 18 pounds, and do not disturb mode to keep it from lighting the displays or making any noise unless Arthur prompted it. Then she guided him out to Outback behind the house where her family was sitting on the grass, and Arthur's Digidex was propped up on an old tree stump. They were listening intently to Data recollect an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation as historical fact. It was then, on Stardate 43872.2, that I was taken prisoner by a collector of rare and unusual artifacts, Kivas Fajo, Data divulged. We had made arrangements to trade with him for hytridium, a rare element required to treat the tricyanate poisoned water supply on the planet Beta Agni 2, that we later discovered Fajo himself had poisoned with artificially synthesized tricyanate. "He poisoned the water just to capture you," exclaimed the youngest, a little boy who looked to be around 8 or 9 years old. "Precisely," said Data. The older man, likely Ella's father, caught Arthur in the corner of his eye and stood up to greet him as Data continued in the background. "Ah, if it isn't Arthur. I'm glad you're feeling well. You had us worried for a while," the man said, reaching his hand out and offering it plumb out towards Arthur. "I'm Agder, and these are my boys, Eden and Cecil. You've already met Ella, and somewhere around these parts is Jonah, my farmhand. Lieutenant Commander Data was just telling us one of his many tales." "Hello, Agder," Arthur said, awkwardly touching his hand to Agder's like a slow-motion high five. "I guess I have you to thank for saving my life." "It's no weight on your back," Agder insisted. "I'd have done the same to anyone. Plus, it was Friar Darren that healed you." "Yeah, I remember a man in furs," Arthur recounted, guessing he was some kind of local medicine man. "Darren's no man. He's Mott, the only magic born in our town. Darren explained and then chuckled, which means he mostly spends his time healing unlucky lads like yourself. Bless him, he saved many lives and mended a load of broken hearts since he came here. Oh, I see, said Arthur, not understanding one bit. Maybe this planet has a weak magnetosphere and stellar radiation wreaked havoc on their DNA, causing a few random mutations. Ella did mention elves. Given enough time, a whole subspecies could form with visible differences, like pointed ears. Or a hairy body, so at least that much is plausible. Sort of. But then magic? Arthur was grasping at straws. He'd just have to see this Mott Darren for himself. What about Data? My spirit, Arthur questioned. You seem pretty comfortable around him. Well, he gave us a good fright at first. Never heard a spirit before, but the tales say they're good fortune, said Agder. Wedwick is small town, lad, but we've seen plenty of folk come and go over the ages. Folk far stranger than a city boy with a spirit pendant. Oh, well, that's good to hear. I was worried I'd get burned at the stake over black magic or something, Arthur admitted, maybe a bit too honestly. Agder gave Arthur a crooked look. I don't think. We'd burn anyone, lad. Plus, you're human. No man has magic that I've heard of. You've got nothing to worry about here, Agder reassured. Say, where do you come from? We asked Lieutenant Commander Data, but he only knows the spirit names. Earth, he said. Could that be Mythendel or Salandria? No, I am from Earth, said Arthur, thinking for a moment whether he should have lied. It's really far away. Another kingdom outside the realm? Questioned Agder skeptically. Then, you must be here on important business for your lord. Actually, I don't have a lord, said Arthur. I was traveling and got lost and ended up here. Agder gave him an incredulous look. Arthur, any man, or boy for that matter, with a carriage and clothes like yours, is a lord's servant. It's good I'm not one of Lordship Delsaren's men. You wouldn't get past anyone with 2 nuts of wisdom with a lie like that. You're a runaway, then? It's okay, lad. We're all friends here. Your secret's safe with us. Arthur stared back, not knowing whether to go along with it or continue pushing the truth. What did he mean by a runaway? Did people keep slaves here? You seem like good kin, and men ought to protect one another. You're welcome to stay with us for as long as you like. I've got some clothes you can wear, and we'll say you're my cousin's son from Mythendel. No one will be the wiser, Agder offered. I just ask you put in your fair share of work around the farm. Live on a farm? He could spend the time here until he was rescued. Assuming he was at the edge of the colonies, he could expect a subspace signal to reach the next nearest colony in a week. Then it'd take some time to get a rescue ship to him. They'd probably only have ships with Mark I FTL drives, so it'd take them a month to reach him, maybe more. In the meantime, he'd need somewhere to stay. He could spend a month in feudal times. It'd be like going to space camp, just the opposite. Thank you, Agder. I accept, said Arthur. I'd be happy to stay with you and your family. Then it's settled. Welcome to our home. You can rest tomorrow, but I expect you to be ready to work the day after. I will, Arthur said. Now I think I have to spend some time talking with my spirit in private, if you don't mind. Not at all, said Agder. Come, kids. We'll hear more stories from Lieutenant Commander Data later. It's time we get started with the morning work. Agder and the kids headed off towards the barn as Arthur walked to the stump and picked up the Digidex. Captain on the bridge! Exclaimed Data by default, a simple voice recording activated by the Digidex detecting its registered user. Sometimes, a Digidex could seem very lifelike on the surface, but the more one interacted with it, the more it became apparent that its intelligence was hollow. If the real Commander Data was sentient, the smart AI Data embedded in the Digidex was far from it. It was still an incredibly useful tool in everyday life, and even more so now. Being tied to the complete works of Wikipedia gave it a utility value of around infinity now, Arthur guessed, as he strapped it back on his arm. Yeah, Data, we can skip the pleasantries. Do I have a concussion? Am I hallucinating? Questioned Arthur. Accessing flight suit biometrics. Scanning vitals. Scan complete. No injuries have been detected. Search the suit's medical log, commanded Arthur. At the time of landing on this planet, list any injuries. I had, no matter how minor. A digital readout began on the Digidex's display. Health status 5:56 p.m., 7/29/2566. Minor concussion, frontal lobe ligament tearing, C2 neck region, collapsed spinal disc, C2 simple fracture, jaw, left internal bleeding, rib nerve 9 region, simple. Fracture, rib nerve 9. Simple fracture, rib nerve 10. Simple fracture, rib nerve 11. Stress fracture, rib nerve 12. More, according to the medical log, less than 12 hours ago, Arthur had been seriously injured, maybe dying, and now he was fine like nothing had happened. He scrolled forward in time on the logs. From 5:56 p.m., his condition was getting worse until 9:42 p.m., when all of the injuries vanished. After that point, they all showed as status healthy. The best regeneration techniques available would have taken at least a couple weeks to heal him. What happened to Arthur wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. Totally and completely. Inexplicable by science. It was like magic, he whispered. Wow, big response over Chapter 1. Glad it hit our HFY's vibe. If you enjoy it and want more, please subscribe in the comments below. I'm using that as a metric for my writing. Here's Chapter 2, Chapter 2. How is any of this possible? Arthur asked. Lieutenant Commander Data rhetorically. Captain, there is insufficient data for a meaningful answer to that question, he replied. After frustrating hours with the Digidex, there was still no way to explain where he was or how he got there. Let alone how his mortal wounds from crash landing were healed in an instant. At first, Arthur guessed and hoped that the anomaly they encountered was formed by a passing FTL carrier, and they had been pulled into it and dropped off somewhere along the carrier's path, like being caught in the wake of a larger ship. But, according to data, the celestial images taken by the escape capsule before landing didn't match any on record. They weren't in known space, and FTL ships, even older ones, were extremely valuable and carefully kept track of. Arthur learned exactly 0 had gone missing since the development of the FTL drive, so that largely ruled out this world as a lost colony. And then there was the language. Everyone he had met spoke modern English. All of this was improbable, as frack. Where in the Heisenberg was he? The only thing he could be sure about was that if he was beyond the colonies, past the fringe of known space, farther than any deep space probe had traveled, then it could take months for a subspace signal to reach anyone. Could the escape pod even transmit a signal that strong? He doubted it. In the back of Arthur's mind were growing doubts that he might never get rescued. If that were the case, then he especially couldn't afford the time to cry and sulk over it. It wasn't a certainty, but it'd be prudent to assume rescue was never coming. There were time-sensitive courses of action that were available to him now, roads in the path of his future that would close and might never open again if he waited for help and didn't act immediately. He wouldn't let himself be stranded on this world with a lifetime of regrets. That meant taking advantage of every available option possible that ensured his long-term survival and possible rescue. His next steps were obvious. While his suit could be slowly charged by walking, the other most survival-critical tool on him, the one that contained the wealth of knowledge from his own world, only had 20 hours of battery life remaining. He had to find the capsule. Arthur looked up from the Digidex, and not far away was a man working near a pair of stables at the edge of the house plot, separating the farmhouse from the fields. As Arthur walked closer, he thought he recognized the man as his features came into view. Was this who carried him into the house? He was stout and broad-shouldered, standing about Arthur's height of 5'7", but twice as wide and significantly more muscular. He looked to be in his early 30s and wore a simple work tunic and boots. As Arthur approached, the man glanced up at him, then went back to working. "Hi, are you Jonah?" Arthur asked. "I heard you're staying with us," said Jonah as he cleaned the stables. "Agder shouldn't be taken in runaways. There's consequences, and he ain't got the copper to spare." "I'm not a runaway. I'm stranded," said Arthur, "and I'll do my best to earn my keep." "Do you know what happens to people who help runways?" warned Jonah. "It ain't Agder's right to decide that for all of us, the children most of all." "I said I'm not a runaway," Arthur insisted. "I just need somewhere to stay for a while." "Just don't get too cozy," warned Jonah, Agder might have a big heart, but push come shove, it's only got room for him and his own. I won't cause any problems, said Arthur. Now, can you tell me where my carriage is? The odd-looking thing that got no wheels? You steal it from a wizard? He asked accusingly. No, I didn't steal anything. Now, can you please tell me where it is? Arthur asked. It's over that ridge, said Jonah, giving a nod towards the row of trees on the far end of the field. He continued working without another word. Thanks, said Arthur. Walking towards the ridge, there was something about his brief conversation with Jonah that made Arthur feel uneasy. Sure, there was Jonah's blatant threatening him, but it was something else. Jonah acted tough, but there was fear underlying his words. He was afraid. Arthur wanted to ask why, but the message was clear. If you helped runways, you were punished, or worse. And it was bad enough or common enough that a farmhand in a small valley town knew about it and was fearful of it. He needed to learn more about Wedwick, whoever Lordship Delcerin is, and gain some basic street smarts of this world, not to mention meet Friar Darren and figure out how he wasn't dead. But first, the pod. The ejection capsule had landed a few hundred yards past the ridge in an outcropping of dirt at the edge of the forest. It was well concealed, but would be immediately obvious to anyone who saw it that it was of unnatural origin on account of being painted bright orange. As Arthur got closer to it, the pungent odor of burned plastic filled the air. Oh crap, Arthur cursed, seeing the interior of the pod for the first time since escaping it. It's no wonder Arthur couldn't track the pod using his Digidex. Burned. To a crisp was an apt description of its cockpit. The interior was coated with a fine black soot, and anything that was remotely flammable had been turned to ash. It didn't take much investigating to discover that the pod's main battery had ignited. The fire even got hot enough to melt the battery's copper heatsink into molten slag. There was little salvageable left inside the pod except the base elements. That remained, mostly copper, titanium, aluminum, and some exotic alloys. Maybe he'd show the copper to Agder. It was an ancient metal, likely not as valuable as the others, but it'd be easier to trade. Arthur made a mental note to find out what metals were available and how much they were worth, but he couldn't spend any time salvaging. His focus had to be powering the Digidex. Data. List anything in the pod that could create electricity, Arthur commanded. Electric motors of varying sizes appeared on his Digidex's display. Half had been inside the cockpit, the other half were deeply embedded, except for maybe the 2 door servos, but it'd take tools to remove them that Arthur didn't have. Even if the survival kit hadn't been transformed into a heap of carbon, it didn't contain anything useful to his survival beyond rations and water. The designers of the interplanetary shuttle didn't expect their occupants to be stranded outside of civilization. The list continued. There were dozens of electrical storage cells in the craft, but most were the size of his thumbnail. There was a battery in the parachute deployment system on the roof, but it was built into a tamper-proof box, and ultimately he'd need a more permanent solution than drawing power from another battery. Then there was the Peltier cooler attached to the life support coprocessor. It was located away from the battery and main computer, behind a reasonably thick maintenance panel. This got Arthur thinking. A Peltier cooler creates a difference in temperatures between its 2 ceramic plates, with the consumption of electrical energy. In the case of the coprocessor, it consumed electricity to cool the processor on one side, while heating the other side of it attached to a heatsink. But the Peltier effect also works in reverse. If a difference in temperature is applied to both sides, say by heating one side with the sun and cooling the other with water, it acts as a thermoelectric generator, creating a potential difference between the 2 plates, i.e. voltage. And the Digidex could regulate it as necessary. It wouldn't be much. Peltier devices were terribly inefficient, often used for their exceptional reliability, but it should be enough, even if he had to charge it for hours each day. Arthur was able to pry back the melted plastic release handle of the life support maintenance panel. With a click, the panel opened, revealing a life support system untouched by fire. In moments, Arthur had removed the coprocessor assembly by sliding it out of place. Under its heatsink was the Peltier cooler, just like the service diagram showed on the Digidex. A simple spring latch held them in place against the coprocessor. Click and flip. And Arthur had the core of his charging device. Arthur's plan was to use the maintenance panel itself as a thermal solar panel. It was conveniently painted black with carbon soot, which would absorb sunlight, and he figured at about 6 square feet it had enough surface area to get pretty hot. He scraped off what thermal paste he could that sandwiched the Peltier cooler to the coprocessor and used it with some salvaged copper wire to secure it to the maintenance panel. The apparatus consisted of the panel, the Peltier cooler, and the heatsink. It was a bit of a janky setup, but it should work. All he'd need was cold water. He was in a mountain valley after all, and despite the warmth of the valley, the peaks still had snow on them. Any river would be flowing with snow runoff, and Agder would probably know where the closest ones were. Arthur disabled his suits. Power-saving mode before stacking his newly built Digitex charger atop the barely recognizable mass of the main computer's heatsink and picking up the bundle. The 50 or so pounds in his hands altogether felt closer to 5 with the suit's EAS engaged, although it was still ungainly. Now it was time to find Agder. On his way back to the farm, Arthur saw Ella feeding the chickens outside of the farmhouse. Thankfully,